Hey everyone, welcome to my channel. Aditya here. So today we will continue our comprehensive AWS sessions. So in this comprehensive AWS sessions, we are continuing our Lambda journey. So now we are in the topic called Lambda in networking, especially in AWS perspective, it's VPC, that is virtual private connection. So now how to deal with Lambda within a VPC. Okay, so we are going to cover that in this topic. So the important point to note here is Lambda could be created within our own VPC or outside of the VPC also. That means you can create Lambda inside or outside of a VPC. Okay, so what is outside of a VPC? So whenever you create a Lambda without specifying any VPC, then that is outside of the VPC. That is actually created inside AWS network. So AWS itself has its default AWS own VPC, but that VPC has internet access. But whenever you create your own VPC, that VPC don't have internet access. So that is the difference. Okay. So the Lambda which was created in AWS network that will have access to internet. But the Lambda which was created in our own VPC, so even VPC also a part of AWS network, but we are strictly mentioning that it is a virtual private connection so that the lambda which is created inside our own VPC won't be able to access internet. Okay, now look at the second point. Since VPC means virtual private connection and your lambda created outside of this VPC, then lambda unable to access the resources inside the VPC like DynamoDB, RDS and Elastic Cache. That means you have a lambda, you created a lambda, but that lambda created outside a VPC. Okay, and also you have a VPC, and inside your VPC you have RDS, DynamoDB, and Elastic Cache, some resources. Now you want your lambda to access these resources inside that VPC. So in that case, lambda will fail to access those resources inside the VPC because lambda is created outside the VPC and these resources are residing inside the VPC. So lambda was unable to access these resources. So just look at this picture or flow diagram where you have your lambda created within AWS environment. Okay, so this lambda can able to access this RDS data source which is created inside the AWS. Okay, AWS network. But in the same AWS network, you have your own VPC. Okay, and inside this VPC, you have another resource DynamoDB. And to access this DynamoDB, Lambda was failing because this DynamoDB is inside another private connection. But other resources which are available in AWS, which are not within some other VPCs, can be able to access by this Lambda. So this Lambda can not be able to access this DynamoDB which is in VPC. And one more thing is this Lambda can able to access the public internet because which is resides inside the AWS network, not within a VPC. Okay, so that's why here it is able to access the public internet. Okay, I hope you understand what will happen if you create a Lambda outside a VPC. Okay, it can able to access public internet, it can able to access other AWS resources which is created inside AWS network. But the same resource, if it was created inside the VPC, then Lambda will definitely fails. Now, if you see the next point, right? Now, if you want to deploy Lambda inside the VPC, okay. Now, if you want to deploy Lambda inside the VPC, since you want to access those resources inside the VPC, so in that case, you need to define VPC ID, subnet IDs, and security groups. So where to define, right? So whenever you are creating a Lambda, right, you need to specify VPC. So if you specify VPC, then Lambda configuration will ask for what is your VPC IDs and what are the subnets you want to deploy your Lambda, and you can able to attach security groups also to your Lambda. Okay, So like that you can able to configure VPC, able to configure Lambda within an VPC. Okay, once you create Lambda within VPC, on the behind the scenes ENA, Elastic Network Interface, will be created in the subnets of VPC selected in Lambda. That means, so we created a Lambda and we configured Lambda to use VPC by adding VPC ID subnets and security groups. Okay, and if you create that Lambda, and behind the scenes Lambda will create this ENA, that is Elastic Network Interface for us. So what is the use of this Elastic Network Interface? By using this Elastic Network Interface, we can access other resources in the VPC. Okay, so that's the purpose. This Elastic Network Interface will be created behind the scenes by Lambda for us. Okay, and remember, only this Elastic Network Interface will be created if you want to create a Lambda within a VPC. Okay, and outside the VPC, this ENA won't be created. Just remember that. Since we need to create this ENI, then we need to have this AWS Lambda VPC access execution role to be attached to the Lambda. So we know, right, access execution roles for Lambdas. So whenever you are creating a Lambda and if you specify VPC to it, then in the execution role section, you have to add this execution role also to your Lambda to create this elastic network interface behind the scenes to access other AWS resources. So just keep this point in mind. You need to add this execution role whenever you are creating a Lambda within a VPC. Okay, so just have a look of this flow diagram. So here the Lambda created within the VPC only, and if you create a Lambda within the VPC and you specify a private subnet or a subnet to the Lambda, then Lambda behind the scenes created this Elastic Network Interface, which was covered by this Elastic Network Interface security group. So by using this Elastic Network Interface, Lambda will be able to access other AWS service here, that is RDC. So here you have RDS, that is relational database, and Lambda can able to access the relational database, but it's not directly, right? It is using this elastic network interface. By using this elastic network interface only, Lambda can able to access RDS. So you have to remember that if you create a Lambda within a VPC, Lambda has to create an ENA, that is elastic network interface. Without ENA, Lambda can not able to access any other AWS resource within the VPC. Okay, so to access other AWS resources, Lambda should have this elastic network interface, and to create elastic network interface, Lambda should have this execution rule. So whenever you're configuring Lambda within a VPC, don't forget to add this execution rule. Okay, so we'll move to the next point. Since we know Lambda created with an VPC does not have internet access, right? So we know our own VPC, if we create an Lambda, Lambda cannot be able to access internet, definitely. And what if your use case requires internet access to Lambda in your VPC? That means you want a Lambda within VPC, but it can able to access public internet. So is that possible? Or what is the limitation to it? Or how to achieve it? We'll look into it. So if you are aware of VPC subnet concept, right? I hope you are aware of VPCs and its subnets when you are learning this Lambda in VPC. If you are not aware of that and if you want to learn that, let me know in the comment section. I will create a comprehensive session on VPC also. In future, anyway, I will create, but I want to prioritize what concept I have to create. So that's why I'm asking you guys. So if you are aware of VPC subnet concept, we know that we have two types of subnets. So remember, we have two types of subnets. One is private subnet, and private subnet don't have internet access. And the another one is public subnet, and the public subnet should have internet access. Okay, so now you understand, right? You have two types of subnets. One is private subnet, another one is public subnet. And private subnet don't have internet access, and public subnet can have internet access. So now you can say I can deploy my Lambda in public subnet so that Lambda can able to access internet, right? So this is our use case, no? Your use case requires internet access to Lambda in your VPC. So in that case, I can deploy my Lambda in public subnet instead of private subnet so that Lambda can able to access internet. So is that works? We'll look into this point. Is deploying Lambda in public subnet provide the internet access? The answer is no. Unlike EC2 instances, were deployed in public subnets allows EC2 have internet access and public IP addresses. But Lambda won't work like that. Okay. So if you have an VPC and inside the VPC you have some public subnets and private subnets, and if you deploy an EC2 instance in a public subnet, that EC2 instance can able to access internet. But similarly, if you deploy Lambda in public subnet, Lambda cannot be able to access internet. So this both works in a different way. Okay. So just remember EC2 can access internet from the public subnet, but not Lambda. So the solution to this problem, right? You want your Lambda to be deployed in your VPC and this Lambda can able to access the public internet also. So the solution is deploying Lambda in private subnet. So you have to deploy Lambda in private subnet. And you know, private subnet don't have internet, right? So to get the internet access, we need to create a NAT instance or gateway. So we call it as NAT gateway. Okay. So we need to create a NAT gateway. And usually this NAT gateway resides inside public subnet. So you have to deploy your Lambda in a private subnet. Okay. And also in one of the public subnet, you have to create a NAT gateway and you have to attach that NAT gateway to your Lambda. Okay. And for better clarity, I will show you the flow diagram. Okay. Just look at this flow diagram. You have your AWS network. Inside this AWS network, you have your own VPC and also one AWS service that is DynamoDB. And inside this VPC, you have public subnet and private subnet. Okay. Inside this private network or private subnet, you have your Lambda. And the resources inside this private subnet like Amazon RDS, Lambda can able to access directly without any ENIs or NATs. Okay, it can directly access this. But if Lambda want to access the public internet, for example, this publicly available external API, Lambda has to go through the public subnet. And in the public subnet, we have to create a NAT gateway. By using this NAT gateway, Lambda can able to access external API. And this NAT gateway with the help of internet gateway can able to access public external API like this. Okay, so you understand, right? To give your Lambda, which is deployed inside a VPC to access public internet, it requires a NAT gateway with internet gateway so that by using this, it can able to access the external API. Okay, and what if you want to access other AWS resources inside your AWS environment? For example, this DynamoDB. This DynamoDB is not residing inside your VPC, but it is residing in your AWS network. So in that case, right, in that case, you can still use your NAT gateway. You have your NAT gateway with internet gateway. By using this combination, you can able to access this DynamoDB. But what if you don't want to use this NAT gateway configuration to access this DynamoDB? Because this NAT gateway will be useful to access public internet. But what if you don't have the NAT itself, right? So in that case also you can able to access other services inside the AWS network. So in this AWS network, you have another DynamoDB, that is a VPC endpoints. So by using VPC endpoints, you can able to access other AWS resources, right? Other AWS resources privately, privately from a VPC. So this Lambda is residing inside the VPC, but it can able to access this DynamoDB which is outside the VPC by using VPC endpoints. Okay, so you want to access from using the NAT gateway, you can use that, or you have other way, that is using VPC endpoints. Okay, so these are the same points, right? To access resources outside the VPC, still we can use NAT with internet gateway. But the other way was to use VPC endpoints. So by using these VPC endpoints, we can able to access other AWS resources privately without using this NAT gateway or internet gateway. I hope you understand the concept. Okay, so we will move into the hands-on part. Until now, we have seen the theory part, how to create a Lambda within a VPC and how to access resources which are outside the VPC, and also how to access resources inside the VPC, right? Now, this is a basic hands-on session to demonstrate that how to create a Lambda within a VPC. Okay, so it's a simple Lambda function, and I will create that and I will show you how to add VPC to your Lambda function and execute your Lambda function. Okay, so for that, first open your console. From the console, right, we will go into the Lambda service. Otherwise, you can go here and search for the Lambda and open your Lambda service. Okay, so either way you can do. So since I have recently visited Lambda, it is listed here, so I opened. And once the Lambda console opens, what we are going to do is we are going to create a new Lambda function. We have opened the Lambda console. Now what I'm going to do is here I'm going to click on create a function. So in the create a function page, right, you can able to choose different options. So I'm choosing either from the scratch, and I'm going to give my function name as lambda hyphen vpc demo. Okay, lambda hyphen vpc demo. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Python as my runtime, and architecture I'm leaving for 64-bit, and permissions I'm leaving same, so I'm not going to touch anything here. Okay, and here in the advanced setting, right, if you click here, you can able to get multiple options. So in this option you can able to do enable VPC. So if I tick here, I can able to add my VPC. So here select your VPC. So I am going to use the default VPC itself, but if you have your own VPC, you can add your own VPC. So this is the default VPC which was created when we create the AWS account. Okay, and here you can option like allow IPv6 traffic for dual stack subnets, but as of now I'm not ticking it. And here you can able to select the subnets. So as I mentioned, you can able to select your subnet IDs, right? So for this particular region, right, VPC, we have these many subnets. So you can select any three subnets. So ABC, yeah. So not only three, I think we can select a number of subnets here, and even security groups. So we can add the default security group, or if you want to add your own security group, right, you can create one for. So to create a security group, right, I'm going to create some security group now, a small security group. So for that, go to your EC2 panel, right, EC2 console. So EC2 console have you have that security group option. Otherwise, you can search for security groups here itself in the search button, but I'm going to EC2 console for your better clarity. So I'm opening my EC2 console here. So once my EC2 console opened, I will show you how to create a security group. So once your EC2 console opens, here in this left side, right, you have these options. So if you scroll down below in the network and security section, you will have security group option. So if you click on the security group, it will open the security group page. So it will list down what are the security groups available. So since we have only one security group, I am going to create a new security group for our Lambda. So in this create security group page, right, we can able to specify the security group name. So I'm calling it as Lambda VPC SG, that means security group. Description is Lambda VPC security group. So you just give your own description, and we need to select the VPC. We have only one VPC, and we can able to add the inbound rules. Inbound is nothing but the traffic into the Lambda, and outbound rules the traffic which Lambda wants to route outside the world. So what I'm going to do is this is to show you how to create a security group for Lambda, but you can add your specific inbound and outbound rules. Okay, so I'm not touching anything. I'm creating an default security group. So click on this create security group. It will create you a security group. So this is our security group for Lambda. So now come back to our create function, and here choose your security group, right? So just do a refresh to load our new security group. And once here, if you list down, you can able to see the new security group has been added in this list. So I'm going to select this VPC. Okay, here we have this inbound and outbound rules specific to the security group will be displayed below. Okay, so once you are good, you can able to click on create function. Okay, wait for some time. It will take some time to create a Lambda function within an VPC. So, but now we'll get one issue. If you see below, the provided execution role does not have permission to call create network interface on EC2. So what does it mean? This create network interface. So if you remember, we have to create ENRate elastic network interface for Lambda, but since we don't have that permission, this Lambda creation was failing. So what we need to do is we need to change the execution role, right? Currently we are using an execution role, which is this one. But instead of that, right, if you come here and change default execution role, if you select this create role with basic Lambda permission, right, it will create a role with basic Lambda permission. And if I click on create function now, right, we'll see whether Lambda was able to create its own execution roles for us based on the requirement, right? We'll see that. Okay. So whenever we clicked on the create function, right, this role was created. So if we are asking for create a new role, also it is taking the same role. So instead of creating a new role, what we're going to do is we will go to this role itself in the IAM section, and we'll add that permission to create network interface, right? So do you remember in the theory section we have discussed we need to create elastic network interface to access other resources within the VPC. So Lambda on the behind the scenes it will create. But to create that network interface, Lambda should have access. So for that purpose only, we need to change this execution role. We need to attach that policy to able to create the network interface. Okay. Okay. So the role open now. So we'll look into it. So it has two permissions. One is AWS Lambda VPC access execution role, and also AWS Lambda basic execution rules. Yeah, in the AWS Lambda VPC access execution role, if you see here, it has this create network interface, delete network interface options. So it was created by default, right? We'll see why we are unable to create here. We'll again try to create this function. Yeah, so now the function got created. Okay, so you need to remember these two execution roles need to be added, right? One is basic execution role, which will useful for creating logs in CloudWatch, and the other one is AWS Lambda VPC access execution role, which will allow you to create network interface, delete network interface, and describe network interfaces. Okay, so this is one option. Otherwise, you create your Lambda function without using that option, right? VPC option, and after once creating the Lambda function, you can go to the configuration section, and from the configuration section you go to the, and if you scroll down you will have one thing called VPC section, right? In the VPC section you can able to add your own EPC. So since we have created with VPC, it's fine, but in case if you created without VPC, right, In that case, you can click on edit and add your own VPC in the same way how we did earlier. Okay. So now we'll try to test this Lambda function. So since it is still creating, because within an VPC, Lambda function creation will take some time, but the performance is same, but the boot up time is slow when compared to the normal creation of Lambda without VPC. So now the Lambda function has been created. Okay, successfully created the function, and okay, fine. So since the function got successfully created, we'll test this function by going to the code. So we'll look into the code first. So here it is loading the code source. We'll wait a couple of minutes. So it's loaded. So this is our Java Python code. Sorry, this is our Python code. Now we'll test this code by clicking on here test. So yeah, to test this code, we need to configure a test event. So I am configuring a test event now. So give it a name to your test event. So I'm giving VPC test demo and clicking on save, right? It will save the test event, and if you click on test now, it will execute our Lambda function. And if you see here, the Lambda function executed successfully. Okay, so this is very basic hands-on, and we added our VPC to your Lambda. But if you want to access the resources outside of the VPC, right? As I said, you need to create an NAT instance in the public subnet, and using that you can able to access public internet. Okay. And one more thing I want to tell you is the network interfaces. How these elastic network interfaces will be created. Okay. Since we know in the configuration section in the permissions, right? If you see here, we have this execution role where we are creating elastic network interfaces, and we'll see where these elastic network interfaces got created. So for that, go to your EC2 console. So in the EC2 console, you can able to see the network interfaces, and I'm opening the EC2 console in the new tab. So the EC2 console opened, and in the left side, if you see here, if you scroll down in the network and security section itself, you can have this network interfaces. If you click on this network interfaces, it will list down all the network interfaces created for our Lambda. So if you see here, for each and every subnet we selected for Lambda, these network interfaces got created. And you can see, right, it is attached with the Lambda security group, Lambda VPC security group, and this is the description, right? So by using this elastic network interface, we can able to access other resources within the VPC. So thanks for watching my video. If you like my video, like, share and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if you want to learn any other topic. I will prioritize and try to create those videos. Thank you.